In today's video, we're going to talk about shading. There are many ways to shade. Lots of drawing materials you can use to shade as well. For a beginner, I definitely recommend you to try out different art supplies and tools to see what you actually like. Some of the common ones include graphite, colored pencils, charcoal, or just use a pen. There are 3 techniques of shading that I like to use. The first one, and the most common, hatching and cross-hatching. For hatching, you're using closely spaced lines or evenly distributed lines. For cross-hatching, you're using intersecting lines to build up a tone or a shade representing darker regions in your drawing. The second technique is called blending. You can use tools such as blending stumps or tissue paper. I like to just use my ring finger. The purpose of blending is to create a smooth transition between light and dark. And the third one is called contour shading, following the contours of the face with shading lines, emphasizing a 3-dimensional form. This technique requires you to know a bit of the anatomy of the human figure. I tend to use this to add interest to my drawing for large surface areas such as the neck or the cheeks. I do recommend beginners to start with hatching. When I was little and learning to sketch, this is what I practiced all the time. To make loose and light shading, you can hold your pencil further back. To make precise hatching, you want to hold your pencil more firm. I like to use my pinky to create an anchor so that my hand can be properly positioned on the paper. If you're a beginner, this is the key technique for you to practice and try to employ in your drawings. Unfortunately, there are no magic tricks or shortcuts you can take. To improve your sketching technique, you have to practice shading, recognizing light and dark surfaces, improve your line work by practicing hatching, and just repeat groups of lines in your artwork. Practicing drawing is just like practicing piano or practicing swimming. You're learning to control your movements better. By practicing, you are improving the way you observe and the way you control your hand. With practice, hatching will become part of your muscle memory. And as soon as your eyes detect light to dark transition, you will automatically know what kind of shading you want to apply. The reason you should practice hatching or any shading technique that you prefer is because shading is really crucial, as it brings depth, dimension, and realism to your portraits. Practicing hatching alone without drawing something from a reference photo isn't going to do much for you. In order to learn how shading works, you really need to understand light and shadow. The first step in shading is to observe and identify where light and shadow fall on your subject's face. Notice the surfaces that catch the light and those that remain in shadow. Rule of thumb is the closer the surface is to the light source, the lighter it will be. For beginners, you can pick a reference that only has one light source, either from above or from a side angle. That way, it's much easier to identify areas you should highlight versus areas you should add shading to. You should also notice the importance of contrast. Intense lighting conditions will create contrast. High contrast requires vivid lines and distinct shadows. Facial features will need to be sharply depicted. Use a precise eraser, such as a pointed one or a Knead eraser, and mold it to the way that you want it to look like to really help you define edges. Again, for beginners, I recommend using a reference photo that has a high contrast on the face, so it's easier for you to identify where the dark and light shades are. For softer, more subtle emotions or a realistic effect, opt for smoother shading transitions. Blend the shadows gradually into the lighter areas to create a softer and more natural appearance. I think of it as a light diffuser effect. When people use a photo app or TikTok filter on their selfies, the most common effect added is blurring on their skin. When you apply this in your sketches, it's kind of like that. Be careful not to add too much of this, because otherwise your sketch will feel washed out because there's no focus. The style of shading you choose can evoke different emotions. When you're creating a high contrast portraiture, you're creating drama, intensity, or a sense of mystery. When you are using soft blending, that evokes gentleness, calmness, or more natural appearance. I most commonly notice this in female portraits. When you're doing a texture shading, so a texture shading is when you do various forms or groups of hatching, that really adds depth and detail and really enhances the realism and visual interest of your drawing. I highly recommend everyone to learn hatching if you like to sketch. Shading is a skill that requires practice and observation. Start with simple shapes and gradually move to more complex facial features. Study light and dark shadow in real life or photographs to understand how they interact on different surfaces. Experiment with different shading techniques to find your preferred style and just have fun with it.